I'm going to show you an amazing game from round 3 of Norway Chess. Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa against Magnus Carlsen. Now, just a reminder of the scores going into round 3. So Ali Reza right on top with 2 classical wins, 6 points. At the bottom, Magnus Carlsen and Praggnanandhaa. Carlsen struggling to find his form so far. Lost that first round against Firuzja. In the second round, well, a real up and down encounter against Vincent Keimer. Both players had chances to win, but it finally ended in a draw. So, could Carlsen play his way into the tournament? Let's find out. But he's got a tough opponent in Pragg, who always is happy with complications. And boy oh boy, did we have a complicated game in round 3. Let's take a look. Pragg playing white, and it's a Sicilian. Carlsen also clearly happy with the fight as he's chosen the Sicilian, and he goes for the Najdorf variation. So white has many different possibilities here. Pragg went for h4. Now this is pretty bizarre. In a weird way, this is a kind of waiting move. You're waiting to see how black commits in the center, whether black plays e6 or e5, or maybe none of the above, and then you'll know where to put this bishop, for example, or this bishop. And h4 can fit in with various systems, but it's unusual to say the least. And Carlsen had his first proper think, 14 minutes over his next move, h6. Here we go again! These little poor moves at the side of the board, we've got 2 of them here. Well, bishop g5 is prevented. However, this could turn into a hook if white later on manages to get in f3, g4 and then g5. So I don't know. This is also another waiting move basically, but not one that would appeal to me particularly. I mean, in the past we've seen e5 played in quite a few games. In fact, Caruana a few years ago in sort of blitz and rapid games was playing h4, but clearly it surprised Carlsen. So h6 played, and bishop c4. So we're going into quite a different kind of variation, this sort of Fischer-Sozin system, but with the inclusion of these moves h6 and h4. It's not clear who benefits from that. So e6, natural to block out the bishop. a3, giving the bishop a home. And now Carlsen thought for almost half an hour over his next move, knight c6. Now that's pretty bizarre, because this is not a critical position, and knight c6 is just kind of a normal move. As he said afterwards, he was curious about the position and started to think quite deeply about it, but it's not practical to spend half an hour in this position in the opening where it's not critical basically. So normal development, the bishop tucks away into the corner, nice and secure. And yeah, we have pretty normal development. Well, it's clear that Pragg wants to go queenside with a pawn hanging around on h4. That looks the most sensible. And the queen goes to e2, so it keeps protecting the g4 square, preventing the knight coming in. h5. So this is very strange. So Carlsen moves the h-pawn again. He clearly didn't want to allow something like castles and then g4, g5. So stops a g4 coming, but it does give away the g5 square. So Pragg goes queenside, and Carlsen is looking for counterplay. Bishop g5. Okay, nice move, occupying the g5 square, and well, one never knows. f4 might be coming, g4 might be coming, depends how black plays. Now, for example, b5 is possible, but in a position like this, somehow you know, white looks quite secure there. You can double on the d file, push with e5. I think, yeah, it's not such an easy position, particularly for black, particularly with that h-pawn loose as well if black castles. So Carlsen, after little thought, decided to sacrifice the exchange, and this is such a routine sack in Sicilian positions. You know, you don't count the material in these kind of positions. You just look at these shattered pawns and think, yeah, you're always going to have some counterplay against the king. But this is perhaps not too bad for white, excuse me, because the bishop does defend the king. Now Carlsen took on a3, but as we'll see, it might have been better just to castle kingside. And the reason is that after this, then the queen still defends e5 along with the knight. So that prevents white pushing with e5. But after queen takes a3, you can see it was possible for Pragg to break straight away in the centre of the board. And that is very disruptive for black. So in exchange, and the knight came back to h7, not a beautiful square. Queen d2, right, this is very nice. Lining up against the bishop, also protecting the bishop on g5. So, you know, if this is exchanged, you can see that opens up the rook. Well, not so easy for black to castle kingside, and besides, there are threats here on d7. So Carlsen dropped the knight back, but of course, you know, now it's not possible to castle. On the other hand, this knight has found a good square on g4. Knight f3, but just in practical terms, it looks like it's turning in white's favour because the king is safe, black's king not so good in the middle, and white's piece is very active. Queen came back, an exchange of bishops, and knight g5. Yep, this knight bouncing around to e4. If knight takes pawn, then, well, look at white's pieces. You just know that something is going to happen here when all of white's pieces are lined up on white's king, basically. So knight g6, knight e4, looking to get in on d6. And if castles, then the bishop, whoops, let me repeat that. If castles, the bishop hangs. So knight takes pawn, but that allows a check. And now this black's pieces are really clogged up. Rook f1, more pressure. So the knight came back, and queen d4. So Pragg has a really nice initiative. His pawns are a mess, but his pieces are wonderful. Knight came back, and knight takes b7. Right, now that's an important pawn to win, because it means that white is always going to find play with that c-pawn. Pragg went for an exchange of queens. So if, let's say, queen takes, take the rook, bishop takes. I mean, this is still a very, very unclear position, but generally, if you're the exchange up and you've managed to exchange off your opponent's rook, so just leaving this one against the minor pieces, that's desirable for white. And white does have a clear plan. Okay, after the check, knight e8. Exchange of queens and c4. So it's absolutely clear what white is trying to do. Get that c-pawn down the board. Now, very tricky move. Got to watch out for, you know, moves like knight e3 or bishop takes c2. So rook d8, that's a very nice move. So just keeping black bottled up. Obviously the knight can't move, and that means the advance of the c-pawn is going to be even more dangerous. If knight e3, you can defend like this. If bishop takes c2 check, well, okay, so black has got the exchange back, but I mean, how do you even start to assess this position? It looks to me like white should be better here. Certainly has the initiative. So Carlsen came back, bishop c6, a prudent move. The computer tells me here that rook fd1 is a strong move. How you divine that is very difficult, particularly when you're short of time. So a reminder about the time control. You have 2 hours for all your moves, and you only start to get an increment after move 40. So 10 seconds is added to your clock each time you make a move after move 40. That's not a lot of time. So both players running short of time. Pragg went for rook b8, which looks plausible. I mean, particularly when the rook is vulnerable and you're also protecting the knight. Bishop takes g2 and rook g1. Bishop moved. And the computer likes c5 here, but okay, still very unclear. But rook g3 played and knight e5. And then Pragg went for c5. Okay, here is where I think you need to have a think. I'm going to have a drink. So if you were playing black here, black to play, how do you play as black? Carlsen's next move is remarkable. To find this when you're short of time is something else. So, black to play. What did Carlsen do next? Cheers. Do you want to improve your chess? Get access to live masterclasses with yours truly? Then subscribe to patreon.com/PowerPlayChess, and for just $25 a month, you get a newsletter with a test game, calculation puzzles, a monthly opening survey, access to an archive with over 100 opening surveys. And you can join in live masterclasses exclusive to patrons where you can ask me questions directly over Zoom. All for only $25 per month. Do subscribe to patreon.com/PowerPlayChess and join the club. By the way, the next live masterclass for patrons will take place this Friday evening, usual time of 8 PM UK. And I'm going to be looking through some of the games from the ACO Amateur World Championship in Kos. There are some really instructive games, and I think we can learn a lot from them. Right, what did Carlsen play with black? Well, he found g5. What an unbelievable move. So you've got to get your calculation right here, but also you have to realise that black's only chance here is to gain counterplay with the pawns on the king side. So that's the rationale behind it. Okay, so what about rook takes pawn? Well, here's the point. Knight d7 wins material. Hits the rook, and if the rook moves, then bishop takes knight. So the point of g5 was that you can't take the bishop. The rook has moved away. Absolutely sensational. What about pawn takes pawn? That's possible. It's actually white's best. And then rook h5 to escape the pin here. And, well, the computer says that this is maybe very slightly better for black, but I mean, it should end in a draw with best play, but basically all three results are possible here. But Pragg made a mistake. He played knight d6. I mean, actually, if you're short of time, this looks really plausible. You're pinning here and exchanging pieces just to simplify seems kind of sensible. It also just brings the knight back into play. But apparently a mistake. So g4 played. So that renders this rook redundant on g3. Well, not quite redundant because it is blockading the pawn, but it certainly can't connect with the other side of the board. A check from Pragg, and then he came back again. So he would be very happy with the draw. But Carlsen wants more. And he was right to play on in this position. He went for knight takes d6, which Pragg said he'd anticipated. He said that it's such a Magnus move. In fact, the best move is bishop c6. So you clear the bishop out of the way. You're obviously a solid blockader. You're protecting the knight. And after this exchange, well, this one isn't advancing for a long time, and the king needs to move, and the f-pawn advances, and black should be winning. But Carlsen went for knight takes d6, which is a very attractive move. It's very tempting. Pragg grabbed the rook, knight e4. Yeah, why did Pragg say this is sort of typical Carlsen? Well, Carlsen loves the initiative, likes these sort of straightforward moves, and it seems to advance his strategy of advancing his pawns on the king side, basically. So it looks like white is in dire straits here with the knight hitting the rook and the pawn ready to advance. In fact, it's not so clear. Now, black should actually play knight f4 here, and it's completely unclear. All three results are possible. But Carlsen went for g3. Incredibly, this is a mistake. And this is the best move. And black has enormous problems here. Impossible to advance, that just gets taken. Remember, there's a pin here. And soon it'll be white's turn on the other side of the board. Excuse me. One simple strategy is to bring the bishop into play, and then soon it'll be possible to advance the c-pawn. But no, c6 played straight away. I mean, it looks very strong. If you've got the chance to advance, why not? In fact, black is still okay here. But, when you're short of time, and both players were short of time, very difficult to see. So, they're down to kind of 30, 40 seconds on the clock. So the best move here is g2. Hitting the rook. And if rook takes, not knight f3 because of rook g8. And that controls the pawn, and this one goes through. But instead king g7, preventing rook g8. And then we've got a position with two queens on the board, which is absolutely mad. This should be a draw, apparently. But, I mean, anything could happen in the next half hour, basically. Well, anything could happen in the next 30 seconds, let alone 30 minutes. Carlsen played king g7 instead. And this loses. c7. Bishop came back to defend against the queen. And rook b8. That's the problem. Carlsen played g2, but he resigned without waiting for Pragg's reply. Basically, you just need to move the rook. So rook takes bishop threatened. If knight c6, you take here. Knight e7 prevents white queening, but then rook b8. And, well, if black gets a queen, then rook e8. Get rid of the knight and make a queen. So, I mean, in this position, that's where, after this move, Carlsen resigned. Yeah, there really is nothing for black after rook d1. I mean, rook e1 is also possible. Wow. It was an extraordinary game. And, I mean, Carlsen came so close to turning this one around with this amazing move, g5. But he faltered at the end. I think it's really interesting what Carlsen said after the game, that he was sort of very curious about the opening, and he sort of went into a deep dive and spent too much time, and he paid for it later, because this is where you really need the time to calculate. Basically, both players were guessing at this point, and, well, Pragg guessed right and won the game. He held his nerve brilliantly, I have to say. That is one of his great strengths, that he's always goes for a win and very happy in these kind of complicated positions. I think he got Carlsen on exactly the right territory. This was not a technical grind position. This was tactics, calculation, and wit. And Pragg deservedly won. But Carlsen, wow, has he ever had a worse start to a tournament? Incredible. So in the classical games, lost 2, and drawn one, but he has won an Armageddon. So let's just remind ourselves of the scores, or have a look at the scores rather, after 3 rounds. So Alireza Firouzja drew against Gukesh, but then he won the Armageddon game. So Alireza out ahead on 7.5, and Carlsen at the bottom of the table with 1.5. Wow. It looks to me like he's been away too long. In the Siegerman Cup, he played his way in by the end of the tournament. So can he do that here as well? But Carlsen does look a bit rusty. Let's see what happens.